Alright, so let's talk about Satan. Yes, that Satan. The one who shows up all through the Bible as the big bad villain. But here's the interesting part. Not many people know that before he became the ultimate antagonist, Satan actually had a pretty respectable position up in heaven. Yep, he wasn't always the prince of darkness that we think of today. In fact, according to the Bible, Satan started off as one of the most honored angels in God's realm. Imagine that. Let's go back to Ezekiel 28, verse 2:15, which gives us a rare glimpse of his original status. This passage, which some interpret as referring to Satan, describes an angel covered in every precious stone, from sapphires to emeralds. Talk about high status, right? The passage goes on to say that Satan was the anointed guardian cherub. Now, we might not throw around the word cherub every day, but it essentially means he was a big deal, a special kind of angel with a position of authority. Picture someone working right next to the CEO of the universe. He had access, power, influence. This wasn't a random side character. Satan held a position as close to God as one could get. Ezekiel even says Satan was blameless in his ways from the day he was created, which means he started off with a clean slate. No evil, no rebellion, just pure goodness. Kind of hard to picture, right? So, what exactly was his job up there in heaven? Well, he was created to serve and glorify God. Something we see in most angels. Imagine if you're a top executive in a huge corporation. Your job is to be an example to others, to lead and to reflect the company's values. That was Satan's original role, except he was reflecting the holiness and majesty of God. He was, in a way, a light bearer. His purpose was to shine in the presence of God, showing God's glory to all the other angels. Some people even speculate that he might have had a role in worship, leading the other angels in praise. But here's the thing. With all that glory, all that authority, and all those fancy stones, something went wrong. And we'll get to the what went wrong part in a minute. But for now, it's like Satan was living the angelic dream. He had it all. Imagine being admired, respected, and trusted by every other angel. He was literally in paradise. So what happened? How does one go from being the ultimate employee of the year to getting fired from heaven? Well, that brings us to the beginning of the desire that would ultimately lead him down the path of destruction. It didn't start with some huge rebellion right off the bat. Nope, it was more subtle than that. But before we go there, just think about this setup for a moment. Satan had everything he could possibly want, and yet that wasn't enough. And that's something relatable, right? How often do we get something we've dreamed of, only to start wanting even more? Satan was no different, even though he was in a completely different realm. So picture it. Satan begins to look around heaven, noticing his reflection, so to speak. Instead of keeping his focus on God, he turns his gaze onto himself. He starts seeing his splendor, his power, and suddenly, God doesn't seem like the only one worth admiring. It's almost as if he starts thinking, hey, I'm something special here. I should get a little more credit. Now, we don't get exact details about what was running through Satan's mind, but you can see how pride can creep in. After all, he was created by God, but instead of focusing on that, he starts focusing on his strengths. In a way, Satan's story is a bit like the classic tale of a character who gets a little too comfortable at the top and starts believing their hype. It's that tragic hero arc, except this one's about as tragic as it gets. We know from the Bible that pride was at the heart of his fall. And while Satan didn't show it outwardly right away, that inward pride started growing into a full-blown desire, one that would soon clash with God's perfect will. So that's where Satan began. A glorious, powerful angel, unmatched in beauty, deeply respected and close to God himself. Yet, with all that prestige, all that perfection, there was a flaw that only started to show from within. It's a lesson, really. One that even a being as magnificent as Satan wasn't immune to. Pride can take root anywhere, even in a perfect environment. And this wasn't just a small case of pride either. It was the beginning of a massive shift that would impact heaven and earth. Now let's talk about how that pride slowly grew into a full-blown rebellion, setting the stage for what we now recognize as the first evil desire. So hold on tight, because it only gets more intense from here. Here's where things start to heat up. Let's talk about the point where Satan's pride started twisting into something much darker, something we might call the first evil desire. You're probably wondering, how does an angel created perfectly by God end up with such a strong desire to, well, go rogue? To get to the root of this, let's look at one of the most telling scriptures about Satan's pride and downfall, Isaiah 14:12-15. Now, even though this passage speaks about the king of Babylon, many scholars believe it's also a veiled reference to Satan himself. In it, we see phrases that go way beyond describing just a human king. For example, it says, "How you have fallen from heaven, O morning star, son of the dawn." Morning star, by the way, translates to Lucifer in Latin. So it's like Isaiah is saying, look at you, you've fallen from this incredible height. You who once lit up the heavens, now you're crashing down. That's pretty intense, right? The next part gives us even more insight into Satan's mindset. We hear these famous 5 "I will" statements. I will ascend to the heavens. I will raise my throne above the stars of God. I will sit enthroned on the Mount of Assembly. I will ascend above the tops of the clouds. I will make myself like the Most High. Whew, that's a lot of I wills. It's like he's got this ultimate to-do list of, let's call it, bad ideas. Satan wasn't just content with being in God's presence anymore. Oh no, he wanted to be in God's place. This isn't just a case of healthy ambition. This is something else entirely. He went from admiring his own reflection to actually plotting to take over heaven. Talk about a career change. Now, the thing to note here is how quickly pride morphs into envy and ambition. In Satan's case, that shift was like fuel on a fire. You see, instead of celebrating his role as one of God's top angels, he started thinking he could do better. The phrase, "I will make myself like the Most High," is key here. Satan didn't just want power, he wanted all the power, and not in some "maybe I'll climb up the ladder and see what happens" kind of way. No, he set his sights on taking over the very throne of heaven. The funny thing is, he was already in a position beyond anything we could imagine. But to him, it wasn't enough. He wanted the ultimate promotion, the one that wasn't available. And that's where things went south. Think of it this way. It's like working at a company where you're the second in command, with all the perks, respect, and access you could want. But then, instead of being happy, you start eyeing the CEO's chair. You start thinking, I could run this place better. I deserve that seat. But in this case, it's God's throne Satan's after, not exactly the kind of power that's up for grabs. His desire wasn't just bold, it was wildly delusional. And maybe that's part of what pride does. It makes us see things in a distorted way. Satan started to believe his own hype, thinking he could actually challenge the creator of the universe. So where did this come from? This is one of those huge questions. Some say it was simply the freedom of choice. God didn't create Satan to be a robot. He gave him and all the angels free will. Satan could love and serve God or choose something else. And in this case, he chose the latter. Big time. But why, right? Why would he go down that path? This is where some theories suggest that Satan's beauty and wisdom were his downfall. Ezekiel 28 hints at this, describing him as perfect in wisdom and beauty. And what's that saying? Beauty and brains are a dangerous mix. Well, it looks like in Satan's case, it was a recipe for rebellion. The thing is, when you're as exalted and celebrated as Satan was, and you start focusing inward instead of upward, pride takes root. He looked at his own attributes and decided he deserved more. And that desire grew. It didn't pop up overnight, but slowly it built up until he was no longer satisfied with being next to God. He wanted to be equal to God. Talk about a big shift. And you know, we see this play out in humanity too. It's like the original template for temptation. Why be content with what you have when you could have it all? Sound familiar? Think back to the Garden of Eden. The serpent, whose, spoiler alert, widely believed to be Satan himself, tempts Eve with almost the exact same pitch. You'll be like God. It's ironic, right? The very thing Satan fell for, wanting to be like God, is the same temptation he later uses on humanity. It's like he's passing down his twisted ambition. So, at this point, we can see that Satan's first evil desire wasn't just about rebelling against a rule. It was about a complete shift in identity and purpose. He no longer saw himself as an angel serving God. He saw himself as someone who could replace God. And this wasn't a private thought he kept to himself. It was a full-blown desire that led to open rebellion. Imagine the scene. An angel, once close to God, plotting behind the scenes, building up this ambition to overthrow his own creator. It's almost unbelievable. But that's the thing about pride. It blinds us. It made Satan see himself as something more than he was, and it pushed him toward an impossible goal. He wanted to be the Most High, but in reaching for that title, he fell the furthest anyone ever has. His ambition and desire for power were the ultimate contradictions. The more he tried to elevate himself, the further he was cast down. And if that isn't a cautionary tale, I don't know what is. So let's say Satan's first evil desire wasn't just a passing thought or a bad day in heaven. It was a radical transformation from humble servant to ambitious rival, rooted in pride and envy. And while he may have thought he was aiming high, he didn't realize that his target would lead him straight into the depths of rebellion. Alright, so now we've got a picture of Satan, once a stunning angel, filled with pride and aiming for God's throne. But here's a big question. How was he even able to make such a choice? I mean, wasn't he created to serve God? And isn't heaven supposed to be a perfect place? Well, here's where we dive into one of the most fascinating ideas in the Bible, the concept of free will among angels. Yep, just like humans, angels had the freedom to choose, and that's exactly what made Satan's rebellion possible. God didn't make angels to be robotic servants following commands without a thought. He gave them the freedom to love, serve, or, in Satan's case, to choose otherwise. Now, why would God even do this? Well, think about it. Forced love or loyalty isn't really love at all, right? For there to be real love, real loyalty, there has to be a choice involved. Otherwise, it's just programming. And God didn't create angels, or us, for that matter, to be mindless followers. He wanted beings who would genuinely choose to be with him. So, even though Satan was created perfectly, he still had the power to make a choice, just like Adam and Eve did later on. It's like giving your best employee the keys to the office, trusting they'll use it for good, but knowing they still have the option to misuse it. And here's where things get interesting. Unlike humans, who are a mix of spirit and flesh, angels are purely spiritual beings. They exist in God's presence, they see his glory firsthand, and they know his power intimately. So you'd think they'd be the least likely to rebel, right? But here's the twist. With all that knowledge and spiritual closeness, Satan still made his own choice. It's as if his pride blinded him to the very reality of God's supremacy. He saw God's throne and thought, yeah, I could totally sit there. Free will is a powerful thing. It's what makes love possible, but it's also what made evil possible. Satan's choice shows us just how far pride can take a person, or in this case an angel, away from their purpose. So, why didn't God just stop Satan the moment that pride crept in? Well, here's one way to think about it. God values freedom highly. He wanted his angels to serve out of love and choice, not compulsion. That's how serious he is about free will. Sure, he could have designed a universe with no option to rebel, but then there'd be no genuine relationships, no meaningful worship, no real loyalty. God wants beings who choose him freely. And with that choice comes risk. In Satan's case, he took that beautiful gift of freedom and twisted it into a path of ambition and rebellion. And here's another thought. Satan's choice also became a lesson. Through his rebellion, both angels and humans can see the true consequences of pride and the abuse of free will. It's like a cosmic example of what not to do, if you will. And here's another thought. Satan's choice also became a lesson. Through his rebellion, both angels and humans can see the true consequences of pride and the abuse of free will. It's like a cosmic example of what not to do, if you will. So, in a sense, Satan's fall became a way for God's other creations to understand the importance of loyalty and the dangers of going their own way. Now, does that mean Satan didn't understand what he was doing? Oh, he knew all right. Satan's choice wasn't made in ignorance. Remember, he was one of the highest-ranking angels, close to God himself. He fully understood the implications, but pride can make even the wisest blind. That's how powerful free will is. It allows for the most beautiful acts of devotion, but it also leaves room for the darkest paths of rebellion. The nature of free will among angels is both a gift and a test. It's what allowed Satan to make his own decision, to shift from serving God to seeking to surpass him. And this choice, while tragic, highlights the depth of God's respect for freedom. He doesn't force loyalty or love, he invites it, even knowing the risks. And that freedom, well, it's what made the first act of rebellion possible. So Satan made his choice, and it wasn't just a bad day at the office kind of decision. This was rebellion on a cosmic scale, and it came with serious consequences, not just for him, but for everything God created. So what happened next? Well, let's talk about the fallout. Revelation 12 verses 7 to 9 gives us a powerful image, a war in heaven. That's right, we're talking about an actual battle in the spiritual realm. The archangel Michael and his angels fought against Satan and his followers, and it wasn't a close match. Satan and his army were cast out of heaven, literally thrown down to earth. Now imagine going from the highest place in creation, God's own throne room, to the dust of the earth. That's not just a demotion, it's a complete, irreversible fall from grace. This wasn't just a slap on the wrist. Satan lost everything he once had: his position, his beauty, his access to God's presence. The angel who once walked among the stars was now, as the Bible says, cast down to the earth. And the result? Satan went from being a guardian angel to becoming the ultimate adversary. In fact, that's what the name Satan means, adversary, or accuser. So he didn't just lose his place, he became the polar opposite of everything he once was. It's like the tragic villain origin story of all time. But here's where it gets even more intense. Satan's fall didn't just affect him, it impacted all of creation. You see, the Bible shows us that Satan didn't stop rebelling after being cast out. Instead, he set his sights on humanity, tempting Adam and Eve in the Garden of Eden, leading them into sin. And from that moment on, his influence has been felt across the earth. That first temptation didn't just lead to their fall. It brought pain, suffering, and separation from God for all of humanity. In a way, Satan's rebellion was like throwing a rock into a perfectly still pond. The ripples spread out, touching everything. And here's a question for you. Do you think Satan regrets it? The Bible doesn't say that he does. In fact, he seems to have doubled down on his rebellion. Now, instead of serving in God's presence, he's working against God at every turn, trying to bring as much damage as he can. It's like he knows he can't win, but he's determined to drag as many people down with him as possible. Talk about bitterness. So, what do we learn from this? Satan's story is a warning of how pride and rebellion can take us further than we ever intended to go, and how the consequences of our choices can spread wider than we ever imagined. His fall led to the first great divide between God and his creation, and his influence is still felt today in the form of temptation, deceit, and opposition to all that is good. Ultimately, Satan's story is a haunting reminder that even the brightest among us can fall when pride takes over. It shows us the devastating path of choosing self over God, a choice that echoes through eternity. But here's the powerful truth. While Satan's rebellion separated him from God, we have been given a path back through grace. Every day we face choices, whether to embrace pride or choose humility, to follow fleeting desires or seek something far greater, eternal. So, if this resonates with you, if you're feeling the weight of that choice, take a step toward light, dive deeper into God's Word, seek truth, and connect with a community of believers who walk this journey together. Let's reject the darkness and pursue a life aligned with God's purpose. And remember, hit that subscribe button for more content that digs deep into life's biggest questions. Stay strong in faith, and we'll see you in the next video.